Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Trumbore with your nightly review for Thursday, February 7th. It's 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time. Dow Jones finished down about 43 points to 13,943. S&P down about 3 points to 1508. NASDAQ down 5 to 3163. Shares in Apple up $13 thanks to hedge fund operator slash activist David Einhorn making waves. I won't get into specifics. Gold closed at $16.72. Oil 95.80, down about 80 cents, and the 10-year Treasury 1.96%. I hope this doesn't fall down. I'm the least mechanical person around, so I went to Staples to try and get an easel. And I thought it would just fold out. It required assembly. I just found that out about an hour ago. That'll be this weekend. Anyway, in Europe, the European Central Bank left interest rates unchanged at 0.75%. ECB President Mario Draghi saying business confidence was returning, but the situation remains fragile. Banks are beginning to return some of the 1 trillion euro the ECB provided to keep them afloat, which is good, but it's 137 billion euro of the 1 trillion. Long way to go. Draghi also had to admit that the appreciation of the euro currency, while a sign of confidence, was bad for industry because it made exports more expensive. At a time when the Eurozone needs growth, particularly in the periphery, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece. Of course, you already have some European leaders, such as French President Hollande, who are calling for the ECB to manage the exchange rate. And he talked it down, Draghi did. Draghi also said the economic weakness in the euro area is expected to prevail in the early part of 2013. Later in 2013, economic activity should gradually recover, supported by our accommodative monetary policy stance, the improvement in financial market confidence and reduced fragmentation, as well as a strengthening of global demand. Well, Spain held its first sovereign bond auctions since the allegation of government slush funds. Among other issues, it sold 2 billion euro in 3-year paper at a yield of 2.8%, which was up from 2.4% a month ago. Spain's 10-year yield is back up to 5.50. Spanish equities are down about 11% since the political crisis erupted. Italy's 10-year bond is up to 4.50% in yield with all the uncertainty surrounding its February 24-25 election. Meanwhile, EU leaders are commencing a 2-day summit in Brussels to strike a 7-year budget deal. As you can imagine, in an era of austerity, high EU spending is a dividing issue among the 27 nations. In the U.S., according to a Rutgers University survey as published in the Washington Post today, 1 in 4 respondents said they were laid off at some point during the past 4 years. Nearly half said they took a step down in status with their next position, while 54% said they have had to accept lower pay. 2/3 said at least 11% lower. It's actually 1/3, 11 to 20% lower, and then another third, about 30% lower. Only 1 in 5 believe jobs and career opportunities will be better for the next generation. So that's depressing. On the budget front, from a Wall Street Journal editorial, a few excerpts. Washington is in a fit of collective terror over the sequester, aka the impending across-the-board spending cuts. Trying to explain the zero economic growth at the end of 2012, White House spokesman Jay Carney blamed Republicans for talk about letting the sequester kick in as though that were an acceptable thing. He left out that President Obama proposed the sequester in 2011. The sequester that nobody seems to love would cut an estimated $85 billion from the budget this fiscal year, starting in March. Half of the savings would come from defense and half from domestic discretionary programs. Medicare providers would take a 2% cut. This doomsday mechanism, as some in the administration call it, was the fallback when the White House and Republicans couldn't agree during the 2011 debt ceiling negotiations. Republicans have rightly concluded, after 2 years of being sucker punched, that the sequester is the main negotiating leverage they have, and may be the only way to restrain spending. So now Democrats and a gaggle of interest groups are denouncing Mr. Obama's fiscal brainchild because the programs they cherish, from job training to education, to the EPA and energy subsidies, to money for Planned Parenthood, are about to get chopped too. But fear not. As always in Washington, when there is talk of cutting spending, most of the hysteria is baseless. In Mr. Obama's first 2 years, while private businesses and households were spending less and deleveraging, federal domestic discretionary spending soared by 84%, with some agencies doubling and tripling their budgets. For example, transportation funding before the stimulus was $10.7 billion in 2008, and in 2013 the budget is still $17.9 billion, or about 67% higher. Education spending more than doubled in Mr. Obama's first 2 years and is up 18.6% to $68.1 billion between 2008 and 2013. The bad news for congressional Democrats and their spending interest is that the noose only tightens after this year. Mr. Obama's sequester mandates roughly $1.2 trillion of discretionary cuts over the next decade. But if Democrats really want to avoid a sequester, they should stop insisting on higher taxes and start getting serious about modernizing the entitlements like Medicare and Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, that comprise the other 60% of government. If they won't, then sequester away. George Will in the Washington Post, his op-ed today was about the need for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. He brings up the old George Mason University economist James Buchanan, Nobel laureate, who passed away last month at the age of 93. It was Buchanan who pioneered the public choice school of analysis. Public choice theory applies economic analysis, essentially the study of how incentives influence behavior, to politics. So Will writes, public choice analysis began in the 1960s when Washington's social engineers were busy as beavers building a great society, and confidence in government reached an apogee that prudent people hope will never be matched. Public choice theory demystified politics by puncturing the great illusion that nourishes government growth. It is the fiction that elected politicians and government administrators are more nobly motivated, unselfish, and disinterested than are persons acting in the private sector. So Will cites the following example. 6 days after Buchanan died, economist Buchanan, House Republicans provided dismal and redundant validation of public choice theory. Representative Mick Mulvaney, Republican, South Carolina, supported by Majority Leader Eric Cantor and Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan, proposed offsetting just $17 billion of the $60 billion aid for victims of Superstorm Sandy, and doing so by cutting just 1.63% from discretionary government spending. Representative Hal Rogers, Republican Kentucky, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, said this would slash and burn important programs, and the measure failed because 71 Republicans opposed it. The political class is incorrigible because it is composed of, let us say, the worst human beings. They respond to incentives of self-interest. Their acquisitiveness is not for money, but for the currency of power, which they act to retain and enlarge. This class can be constrained, if at all, not by exhorting them to become disinterested, but by binding them with a constitutional amendment. So let me go back to yesterday. These are the Congressional Budget Office figures just released. And these are the deficits we've been running. $160 billion, first year of the Obama administration, $1.412 trillion, and so on. $5 trillion, first 4 years total, estimated $845 billion for the fiscal year ending this coming September 30. And then you see, according to the CBO's estimates, the deficit goes down, but then begins to rise again. So why is that? And I just hope this sticks in you. So this is spending, next 10 years, mandatory, which would be Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. The lion's share of mandatory spending is on those three programs, and then you have unemployment compensation and some other income security items. Then this is discretionary spending, so mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and net interest. And you can see $2 trillion in mandatory spending in 2012, projected 3.5. This is how entitlements are going to be growing over the next 10 years, and then it explodes after that. Maybe we'll get into that next week. Discretionary spending holds. But understand, if we have another war, Katie bar the door on these numbers. And look how net interest, because our debt has been exploding, and assuming a normalized interest rate environment, net interest expense by 2022 in 10 years is $800 billion. It's just astounding. Revenues are growing during this time, by the way, from $2.449 trillion in 2012, that was the actual figure, fiscal 2012, to $4.734. If you add these three up, you get 5.691 minus 4.734 is a deficit of $957 billion, and climbing from there. Well, I'll just keep harping on this. Turning overseas, as part of Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's historic visit to Egypt, the first by an Iranian leader since Tehran severed diplomatic ties with Cairo in 1980 to protest the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, Camp David. He gave an interview, Ahmadinejad, to some newspaper editors and said, once it was translated, "The people of Iran are ready to march on Israel to wipe it out if it launches into an adventure against Tehran and attacks the country. The Zionists hope to aggress Iran and attack it, but they are very afraid of the Iranian reaction and of the consequences of such an attack. Our defense forces are capable of dissuading any aggressor and making him regret his act." On the issue of talks with the U.S. on the nuclear front, Ahmadinejad said his country cannot hold meaningful talks with Washington when it's threatening Iran. Talks are meaningful only if they are based on mutual respect, justice, and equality, he said. Things will be fine if the Americans correct the manner in which they address us. Earlier, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei said Washington was pointing a gun at Iran. Talks were thus out of the question. Last Saturday, Vice President Joe Biden said, sure, we can hold direct talks. In Israel, President Shimon Peres said the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran was growing under the terrifying dictatorship ruling the Islamic Republic. The Iranian danger has grown, Peres told Parliament. It threatens our existence, the independence of the Arab states, the peace of the whole world. In Egypt, with the economy reeling and in a state of depression with tourism dead, the U.S. State Department issued a warning last night. U.S. citizens traveling to or living in Egypt to the continuing They're alerting U.S. citizens traveling to or living in Egypt to the continuing possibility of political and social unrest, incidents of which have led to recent violence. U.S. citizens are urged to remain alert to local security developments and to be vigilant regarding their personal security, i.e. stay the hell away from Egypt. In Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, after the assassination of a prominent opposition leader unleashed major protests, the Prime Minister announced he would form a new government of technocrats to guide the country to elections as soon as possible. So this sounded like a solid concession to the opposition, which has been demanding some role and positions of influence in the Islamist-dominated government. The Prime Minister Hamadi Jabali addressed the nation. This is a sad day that shook the country regardless of our differences. We are at a crossroads and we will learn from it to make a peaceful Tunisia, secure and pluralist, where we may differ but not kill each other. But not so fast, Mr. Prime Minister. The ruling Ennahda party rejected Jabali's move, saying he did not ask the opinion of his party. 4 opposition groups had pulled out of the National Assembly in protest. France announced it was closing its schools in Tunis. So it's the secularist versus the Islamist, just as in Egypt. And in a new video uploaded on YouTube, a cleric from the Nusra Front, an anti-Assad Islamist militant group that the Obama administration has classified as a terrorist organization, said that brute force against Mr. Assad and his disciples was the only solution. We will cut their heads, we swear to kill them all, and they will see our worst war, said the cleric, speaking from Aleppo, holding a sword in his right hand. No for the negotiations, no for the talks, and no retreat, and a jihad for God's sake. But the guy is Libyan. Oh, that's all for today. I'll be back with you on Monday. Check out my weekend review. Have a good weekend. Stay safe for the snowstorm. Bye-bye.